Money. For most of us, it virtually guides our lives. Nearly every single decision we make can be tied back to money in some way. Where do I live? Should I take this job? What kind of car can I drive? Can I afford to travel? Should I order takeout or just cook at home? So why is it that in school we learn about calculus and biology and the literary works of Shakespeare, but not about the topic that probably has the most relevance throughout our adult lives? Well, there are many reasons. Some believe that teaching personal finance is the responsibility of the parents. Some people believe the same thing about sexual education, but states with very comprehensive sex ed programs have lower rates of teen pregnancy, so I think we can safely assume that teaching financial literacy to high schoolers will probably lead them to making better financial decisions in the future. Plus, financial education is not a topic covered by standardized testing, like with AP tests or the SAT. When schools are judged based off of the results of their students' test scores and subsequently receive funding based off of that performance, there's little motivation for schools to teach any subject outside of the scope of standardized testing. And this is not a dig at the public education system. Education in the US is criminally underfunded, and I completely understand that schools will do whatever they need to survive. Additionally, finding educators who can reliably and enthusiastically teach the subject of personal finance can be really challenging. Teaching high schoolers the ins and outs of health insurance and how tax brackets work and credit cards can be really difficult, especially when many high schoolers don't even have their first job yet. Personal finance is constantly changing with new political administrations and changes in legislature, so a teacher will have to consistently update their material every single year. And if I can conspire with you all for a second, the government and Big Brother have a financial incentive to keep the population financially ignorant and encourage consumerism and spending everything you earn so as to continue lining the pockets of the uber wealthy. If you don't understand personal finance, it's much easier for banks and big corporations to convince you to part with your money. It's like when you discover that your grandma is still spending $20 a month through AOL just to have an email account. Ignorance may be bliss, but it can cost you a lot of money in the long run. So, in a perfect world, what should you have learned in school about money? Well, in this video, we'll cover 6 things that you absolutely need to know no matter how old you are. First, know that compounding interest is your greatest asset, but also your greatest enemy. I think if more people understood compounding interest, more people would understand why there's such a broadening wealth gap in our society. Compounding interest is the reason that the rich get richer so quickly, and it's also the reason that the poor struggle to break out of poverty. Mathematically, compounding interest is pretty basic on the surface. Let's say that you have $10,000 invested at a 10% annual return. That means that after 1 year, your investment will grow $1,000 to a total of $11,000. The following year, that entire investment again grows at 10%, netting you an additional $1,100, bringing your total up to $12,100. The gains generated from that portfolio are fed back into the portfolio to be invested again, thereby generating more gains and so on. After 30 years, your initial $10,000 investment would be worth $174,000 without you ever having to add in any more money or lifting a finger. So you can see that if you have enough money to set aside for investments, you can set up a pretty solid financial future with relatively low effort. Eventually, with a large enough portfolio, your investments could be returning more money than you need for living expenses, so you could quit your job and live off of your investments indefinitely. But the dark side of compounding interest is when you talk about debt. If you had $10,000 in credit card debt at a 10% annual return, it would grow just like the investment example did, except now it's money you owe, not money that you own. If you ignore the debt for 30 years, which I definitely don't recommend, you would owe $174,000. Obviously, that's an extreme example, but when your interest generates more interest, which generates even more interest, it can be increasingly difficult to dig out of that hole. At that point, you have to throw way more money at your credit card debt than just the minimum payment because you need to get ahead of that compounding interest if you ever want to make any progress at eliminating that debt. And a 10% interest rate on a credit card is actually really low. Usually it's much higher. Probably the worst financial situation you can be in is in debt with a payday loan. You should avoid these at all costs. Some states regulate the interest while others don't. So depending on where you live, you could be paying off a loan that's charging you 700% interest. That means that if you took out $1,000 for something, you would owe back $7,000 in interest alone. That being said, at the end of the day, debt is just a financial tool, and it can be used wisely, sometimes even in your financial favor. Big financial gurus like Dave Ramsey preach being debt-free ahead of prioritizing almost everything else, but I think that's a little bit of an outdated mindset. Some types of debt, like mortgages or car loans typically, charge simple interest, not compounding interest. This means that your interest is fixed and it does not generate more interest. If you can find loans at small enough interest rates, usually maybe around 4% or so, it sometimes actually makes more sense to pay off the debt on schedule and just throw all of your extra money at investments. For example, if your mortgage charges 4% but the stock market is returning 10%, you'll come out ahead by 6% if you throw all of your extra money at the stock market instead of at your mortgage. Of course, investing always carries some amount of risk. Just because the stock market returned 10% in past years does not mean that it's going to do that again this year. Conversely, debt is guaranteed. The interest rate is fixed, so that's why there are different schools of thought on how to approach debt versus investing. Ultimately, though, financial success is driven by understanding compounding interest, using it to your favor by investing, and avoiding high-interest debt. Second, you should know how taxes work. There is a lot to be said about US taxes, so I won't bog you guys with too much detail here, but I do want you to understand the fundamentals. When you get your first job, you might be surprised at the amount that's actually taken out for taxes. On your pay stub, you'll see 3 or 4 line items for taxes, usually charged at different amounts. You'll have your Social Security and Medicare taxes, which combined are called FICA taxes. In total, you pay a flat 7.65% of your income to FICA taxes, at least in 2020. You might also have a state income tax if you don't happen to live in one of the few states without one. Depending on the state, this might be a flat tax of your income or a bracket approach. The big one is federal income tax. There's a huge misconception about how federal income taxes work, which is really important to understand. Federal income tax is based on a bracket approach, not a flat tax system. These tax brackets will be different depending on if you're single or if you're married. So for now, let's look at these single tax brackets for 2020. For the first $9,875 that you make, you owe 10% of that to federal income tax. For the next $30,250 that you earn, or income earned between $9,876 and $40,125, you pay 12% income tax. The next bracket goes to $85,525, which jumps to 22%. Only the income made between $40,126 and $85,525 is taxed at this 22% rate. The rest of your money is taxed at 10% and then 12% up to those bracket levels. The highest tax bracket is all income above $518,400, which is taxed at 37%. Many people wrongly believe that the tax rate in your highest income tax bracket is what you're charged on your entire income, which is not true. Because of this misconception, I've even heard cases of employees denying a raise because it pushes them into the next tax bracket, wrongly believing that that raise will be offset by the increase in federal taxes. Nothing could be further from the truth. When it comes to federal income tax, earning more money will never make you come home with less money after taxes. Only the money earned in that higher tax bracket will be taxed at that higher rate. So where does the process of filing taxes come into the picture? Once a year, the IRS requires you to tee everything up and make sure that you've paid your fair share of taxes. No more, no less. Depending on what you do for a living, most employers will typically try to calculate, at least to the best of their ability, how much an employee will owe in tax by the end of the year, and then withhold a consistent amount each paycheck. So ideally, you don't owe the IRS anything when you have to file your taxes. This is easier for people who are salaried because they earn a consistent amount each paycheck, but for people who are hourly or part-time, this can sometimes lead to cases where your employers will withhold too much tax because they don't know how much you're going to work throughout the year. Thus, once you file your taxes for the year, the IRS will give you the amount that you overpaid back, which is called your tax refund. I'm planning on releasing a video early in the new year about the actual process of filing your tax returns step by step, so consider subscribing and turning on bell notifications if you want to see that video when it comes out. And while you're at it, please consider giving this video a like if you're enjoying it for the YouTube algorithm. It really helps out small creators like myself. Third, know that your credit history is really, really important. Your credit history is what tells banks and other lenders that you're a trustworthy borrower. In the eyes of the banks, the better your credit history, the more likely you are to actually pay off your loan. If your credit history is poor, banks will deem you a risky borrower. This means that they might deny you a loan completely, approve you but for a smaller amount, or charge you a higher interest rate to help offset the risk of you defaulting. Your credit history drives your credit score, which is exactly what it sounds like. Contrary to popular belief, however, there's not just one credit score used by banks and lending institutions. Most people have more than one credit score even if they don't realize it. Some of the more commonly used credit scores are based off of the FICO and VantageScore models. The agencies that calculate these scores source their information independently and don't communicate with each other, so it's possible that your score can vary depending on which institution is pulling your history. Usually, credit scores will fall between 300 and 850. A score below 550 is considered poor, whereas a score above 700 or 750 or so is considered good. Paying off your loans on time every month will be a positive mark on your credit history, thereby improving your credit score. If you don't pay at least the minimum payment or skip payments entirely, your credit score will take a hit. One of the biggest factors that influences your credit score is actually just time, so the sooner you can start establishing a positive credit history, the better. A really great way to do this is with a credit card. Not only do credit cards come with a bunch of perks like airline points and fraud prevention, but they're also a really great way of establishing positive credit history. Every time you make purchases on a credit card and then pay the statement balance back in full every single month, you're showing banks and other lending institutions that you're a trustworthy borrower. You borrowed money from the credit card company and then paid it back right away. Fourth, you need to create a realistic budget and stick to it. I say realistic because all too often people will write down their expenses and just list the most basic ones like housing, food, and transportation. Most people who are new to budgeting will actually often underestimate their spending, and then they'll feel overwhelmed and quit after a while because they keep going over their budget without realizing it every single month. Budgeting is like dieting. If you expect it to be a quick fix without much effort, it's not going to work. It has to be a lifestyle change. And that's why it's important to really capture every single category that contributes to your monthly spending. Rent, mortgage, utilities, housing insurance, pet care, car maintenance, food, medication, gifts, travel, entertainment, nights out. The list goes on. You have to take a hard look at your lifestyle and create a budget that's both financially responsible and sustainable. And I think sustainability is a really important area that most people overlook when they create their budgets. Humans are like sticks. We can bend a little, but bend too much and we break. Man, I really gotta stop it with these analogies. Budgeting is impossible if you don't actually track your money. How will you know if you're succeeding in meeting your budget if you don't actually know how much you're spending in each category? Luckily, there are some great apps out there that will do this for you. Apps like You Need a Budget and Mint will automatically connect to your different bank accounts and credit card accounts and categorize your spending so that you know exactly how much you're spending in certain categories and whether you're over budget, under budget, or meeting your budget. This is a really good thing to get into at a young age because you'll be able to see your growth over time, and hopefully this should encourage you to continue working towards your financial goals. Finally, you do not need to be an expert to know how to invest. As of 2020, only 41% of Americans under the age of 35 have any money invested in the stock market, much lower than any of the older age groups. Of course, a big driver for that low number is that young people tend to be bogged down by high student loan debt, unemployment, or low wages. But I think part of the reason is also because people don't understand how investing works, and because they don't understand it, they're scared of it. Within the stock market, there are really two main ways to invest. I'm not here to say which way is better overall, but I do think that one method is way better for beginners and people who are new to the concept of investing. The first way to invest in the stock market is to purchase shares of individual stocks. So in this method, you would pick a company, like let's say Apple for instance, and you would buy a set amount of shares. How much each share costs is completely dependent on the stock. The price of the shares, and subsequently the value of your portfolio, will go up and down depending on supply and demand. Understandably though, purchasing shares of individual stocks can feel really overwhelming to new investors. How can you predict whether a company will perform well or poorly in the future? If your goal is to save for retirement, how can you be sure that the companies that you've picked right now won't be completely worthless in 40 years? How do you decide what percentage of your portfolio should be invested in one specific company? To minimize the risk of one company failing, it makes sense to diversify and buy a bunch of different stock from different companies, but keeping track of 30 plus different stocks seems really daunting. At what point does it just feel like gambling? I think investing in individual stocks is what most people think of when they hear about investing, but because it seems so intimidating, many beginners are too afraid to start. That's why there's another way to invest in the stock market which is simpler, easier, and at least in my opinion, better for beginners. There are investment options called mutual funds, index funds, and ETFs. All three of these options are very similar, so I'm just going to talk about them as a whole. By investing in a mutual fund, index fund, or ETF, you are investing in a very small sliver of a bunch of different stocks all in one package. For example, one of the most common index funds is the Vanguard Total Stock Market Index Fund, or VTSAX for short. One share of this index fund is roughly $93 at the time of filming this video. By purchasing this share, you're investing in a tiny sliver of roughly 3,500 individual stocks, proportional to their overall size in the stock market. Essentially, this means that by buying one share of VTSAX, you're investing in the US stock market as a whole. So if the whole stock market goes up, so do your investments. If it goes down, so do your investments. This is pretty much maximum diversification, which is a pretty good position to be in because it reduces your overall risk. If one company goes kaput, well, it doesn't really matter because there's roughly 3,500 other companies driving your portfolio. And since the US stock market as a whole has returned roughly 8 to 12% per year, I'd say this is a pretty good return on your money. Some index funds, mutual funds, and ETFs will invest in the top 50 or top 100 or top 500 companies and stocks of a specific category. So there are a lot of options out there if you don't want to invest in just the whole stock market. And to give you guys even more confidence about this investment method, last year in 2019, only 29% of fund managers, so people whose literal job is to invest in the stock market for their very wealthy clients, only 29% of them beat the S&P 500 after fees. And the S&P 500 is the stock market performance of the largest 500 US companies. Granted, 2019 was a pretty great year in the stock market, but that trend is consistent even in lower performing years. There's a lot more to learn about investing, but that's really the basics. If you're a beginner and you're unsure of where to start with your first investment, a really great place to start is with a Roth IRA. I have a video which explains Roth IRAs in more detail and takes you through the process step by step, so I'll link that video up here if you guys want to check it out. Financial literacy is such an important skill for everybody, especially people entering adulthood and being able to make financial decisions that will impact the rest of their lives. It's a real shame that financial education is not taught in schools, but since we live in the age of the internet, you can now teach yourself pretty much anything online. If you're still in high school or just recently graduated, check out my other video on how to manage money as a teenager, which gives you more detail on the steps that you need to be doing today to better set up your financial future. And if you guys learned something from this video, please give it a thumbs up. I make videos every week on all sorts of different personal finance topics, so consider subscribing and turning on bell notifications if you want to see more content like this. Thanks for watching, and I will see you all next week.